This episode contains descriptions of violence and sexual assault that may be triggering or difficult for some listeners. As always, we'll try to cover it in a way that's honest but not gratuitous. However, if you want to avoid this kind of content, consider sitting this one out. Welcome to Crime and Sacrifice. My name is Brianna, and this is episode 7, Shawcross, Part 3. In the first part of this series, we talked about a string of serial murders that began in the late 1980s in Rochester, New York, that baffled police as the bodies of sex workers and other vulnerable women began piling up. With no leads and more than 10 victims, it was in January of 1990 that police would have their first real break in the case, discovering a suspect by pure chance while doing an aerial search for more bodies. That suspect was Arthur J. Shawcross, and they would discover that he already had a conviction of manslaughter for the most heinous of crimes, the sexual assault and murder of 8-year-old Karen Ann Hill. He had also admitted culpability in the death of 10-year-old Jack Blake in Watertown, New York. We discussed these crimes and Arthur's early life, his descent into a person capable of these acts, in Part 2. Today, in the final chapter of the Shawcross series, we'll take a look at what happened in those intervening years, how Arthur ended up back on the street after less than 15 years in prison. Not on anybody's radar in law enforcement in the Rochester area. Back in Watertown in 1972, the DA at the time, Will McCluskey, had ironed out a plea deal with Arthur's lawyer. McCluskey believed that children were in immediate danger and knew that he had to do whatever possible to get Arthur off the street. With only a shaky confession and circumstantial evidence to make his case, McCluskey believed that a conviction, should the case go to trial, was far from certain. They ultimately agreed to an indeterminate 25-year sentence for Karen Ann's murder and assault. For Jack Blake, Arthur admitted culpability, but insisted that it had been an accident. Months had passed before Jack's body was found, and the medical examiner couldn't say for sure what the cause of death was. Chillingly, it was apparent that he had been stripped before he died, but there was no concrete way to prove that Arthur had murdered him. And so it was only for Karen Ann's murder that Arthur was sentenced. Within the day, Arthur was shipped off to Attica to serve his time, and everybody involved in his conviction hoped that he would spend the full 25 years behind bars. But this is not how things played out, and in less than 15 years, he was back on the street. With his return to Attica, Arthur soon slipped into the familiar rhythm of institutional life. His counselors reported that Arthur seemed to do well in these kinds of regimented settings, respectful to prison staff, and good at keeping to himself. His first months passed quietly as Arthur was able to keep in the background and avoid conflict with other inmates, never getting close to anybody else, and never getting into trouble either. At first, the other inmates didn't know why he was in prison. But if word got out that he had been convicted of crimes against children, there would almost certainly be a target on his back. And so it was in his best interest to keep quiet about why he was in. But of course, prison officials knew why he was there. There were also a number of counselors and psychiatrists tasked with trying to figure Arthur out, to figure out what had happened to cause him to commit these crimes. Arthur was not a straightforward case, and for as many counselors that tried to analyze Arthur over the years, there were just as many different theories about what went wrong with him and what drove him to kill. Their theories ran the gamut, from those that pegged Arthur as a dangerous sociopath, capable of concealing his true motives, and of a certain cunning that made them doubtful if he could ever be rehabilitated, to those that believed the killings could just be an anomaly in his life, that with therapy and time, Arthur could be successfully conditioned for release. And regardless of their beliefs about him, it seems clear that Arthur was pretty good at acting normal when it suited him. He was friendly with prison guards and had a way of disarming people with everyday interactions that made them think he was fairly normal, if a bit quiet or withdrawn. Those that knew what he had done were surprised by the glimpses of charm, of a sense of humor. This probably added to the confusion of those meant to analyze him, as it wasn't as simple as writing him off as some kind of monster or nutcase. But they got to work trying to figure him out. Arthur had a hard time talking about his crimes in Watertown, and would get choked up at times, though his emotions seemed to have a self-centered tinge, a sadness at his current predicament and that of his family, rather than any genuine empathy toward the victims and their families. His emotions seemed to rule out psychopathy, if his reactions were to be believed. Many kept searching, digging into his past and looking for evidence of trauma. But it was around this time, after his first several months at Attica, that Arthur's time in prison was about to become a lot harder. Somehow word got out among the other prisoners about why he was there. When the other inmates learned that he was a child killer, Arthur went from the quiet guy in the background to one of the most despised inmates in Attica almost overnight. Pretty soon he was the target of violent assaults, was spit on and cursed out by other inmates. His spotless prison record began to be filled with incidents, violent fights and altercations with other inmates. Not long after this, and for his own protection, Arthur was transferred from Attica to Greenhaven Correctional Facility, with prison staff hoping the excitement around Arthur would die down. But word about his background spread to Greenhaven too, and his harsh treatment from other inmates continued, with almost constant threats, insults, and attacks. A new set of psychiatrists and counselors got to work trying to understand him. But Arthur seemed more closed off than ever, instead engaging in a cascade of self-pity regarding his current lot in life, how he lived in fear while in prison. He would frequently bring himself to tears during interviews with Greenhaven counselors, when talking about how hard he had it, his constant fear at being assaulted. Attempts to understand him stalled out, and Arthur became less cooperative, not the model inmate he had once been. And it seems that some of his fear was genuine, that he might be on the verge of becoming unhinged. It became difficult for staff to be able to coax him out of his cell at all. He was that afraid of other inmates. In one specific incident, he splattered paint all over the walls of his cell and set his own mattress on fire. It's hard to overlook the fact that his situation, as an object of hatred for other inmates, was completely self-imposed, given the brutal and disgusting nature of crimes that he had willingly committed. But it may also be true that those violent first few years in prison may have made Arthur's rage and capacity for violence even worse. Not only was he despised by other inmates, but Arthur claimed that he felt abandoned by his family in prison. They had been mainly supportive before throughout all of his short jail sentences and even his prison terms for things like arson and burglary, comparatively minor offenses. But now his family distanced itself from him entirely. His father, Arthur Sr., refused to speak to his son at all. His mother Bessie would still talk to him on the phone occasionally, but she would not visit. Throughout more than 14 years at Greenhaven, Arthur was always waiting for Bessie to come to visit him. She never did. Arthur still had his wife Penny, who had married him after finding out she was pregnant. She had later miscarried, but still refused to believe what the press or the police were saying about Arthur, and vowed to stick with him. She was the only one who seemed willing to take an active role in Arthur's life at this time, keeping in touch with him, writing letters, telling him that she believed he was innocent, but not visiting as often as Arthur would have liked. Whether out of cruelty or guilt, Arthur eventually sent her a letter saying that he was, in fact, guilty of the crimes, and that she was the only person too stupid to see it. Their marriage ended very soon after this. Because his conviction of 25 years had been an indeterminate sentence, there was always the possibility that Arthur could be released early, which led to routine appearances before parole boards throughout his time in jail. The boards that saw him during his first few years in prison would always swiftly deny his application, issuing statements like the following: "A release of this man to the community at this time, given his lack of change in behavior, might result in the murder of several more children." And for the first 10 years in prison, Arthur also seemed to believe that release was unlikely, and he did little to try to impress the board. Arthur had also become a difficult patient for counselors and psychiatrists, quick to anger and not forthcoming with his answers to their questions. When he was forced to sit for interviews with them, Arthur never seemed to take it seriously, taking an attitude that he was doing them a favor. And he seemed to take no personal interest in trying to figure himself out. There were several voluntary counseling groups that Arthur could have joined, but he seemed to have no interest in doing more than what was required of him. Years passed, and in time, the disgust and attention of other inmates began to fade, as Arthur became a long-term fixture at Greenhaven. Without the negative attention and fear of being assaulted, Arthur's behavior again shifted, returning to that of a seemingly well-adjusted and obedient convict, especially after the first decade in prison came and went. Maybe he began to feel hope that he could really get out one day soon if he would just play by the parole board's rules. For whatever reason, Arthur became more than just a model prisoner and made a show of how he had improved during his time in prison. He started going to more voluntary therapy sessions, got his GED, and seemed to be trying harder than ever to be pleasant and civil with other people. Knowing in hindsight what happened after he got out, this suggests a cunning or calculated side to his personality, that he could control himself and manipulate others when it suited him. But at the time, many of his counselors noted Arthur's increased motivation and participation in their files on him as a positive development. He had appeared to begin taking an active interest in understanding himself, appearing to show remorse for his crimes during therapy sessions, which was a shift that made some counselors think that he was making progress on the road to rehabilitation. There were others that were skeptical, but again, there were so many counselors and psychiatrists that saw him through the years, and there was never any professional consensus. Some counselors believed that it was trauma that caused Arthur to act out, which may have fit a certain narrative they had in mind about serial killers at the time, and offered at least some kind of explanation. Besides the abuse Arthur claimed to have gone through as a boy, he also talked about the violence he had witnessed and that he had taken part in while in Vietnam. He talked about going on hunts to slaughter members of the Viet Cong as a one-man commando, how the top military brass thought he was an animal but gave him free rein because they wanted bodies. He said that he had murdered children, had raped women, and even engaged in acts of cannibalism. For some of the psychiatrists working with him, this also seemed to make sense. How the pent-up violence in him could have spilled out during his time in Vietnam, and how he might have taken it back with him into civil society when he rejoined civilian life. By finally admitting these events had taken place, some counselors thought that they were getting somewhere, that Arthur was taking a step toward self-awareness that might help him control and understand his own impulses. And they wanted desperately to be able to pinpoint these causes and help Arthur control himself as the 14-year mark for his sentence came, mindful of the fact that Arthur could be released at any time. Because of the way sentencing worked in New York State, many were aware that Arthur's likely maximum time in prison, given that he was once again an obedient inmate, was 17 years for good behavior. And so it was that, despite his conditional 25-year sentence and the horror of his crimes, the parole board finally decided to grant Arthur's release in March of 1987. Yes, there were warnings from some staff and psychiatrists working at Greenhaven. But there were also signs of progress, and Arthur seemed like a clean-cut and mild-mannered man that checked all of the prison counselors' boxes. They believed he was actively working to understand his past, was trying to gain skills and tools for preventing his anger and sexual urges. When the parole board made their decision, they noted that they were pleased to see that Arthur had started going to voluntary counseling, that he seemed to have a plan for the outside, some potential jobs lined up. He also said that he intended to continue with counseling after release, which they took as a good sign. And they must really have believed that his threat to society had passed. What's more, they knew they wouldn't be able to keep him in prison for longer than 2 more years, and probably figured that whatever progress would be made with Arthur already had been. We now know this was a terrible and tragic mistake, and it shows how fragile or inconsistent our system of paroling prisoners is, that it is far from a perfect science or system, and is in some ways an impossible job. Arthur later admitted that he felt scared about what he might do to another kid if he was released. Of course, he kept these fears to himself. Arthur had requested that he be sent to Delhi, New York, when he was released. While in prison, he had developed a relationship with a woman named Rose Marie Wally, who had become a pen pal of his, and then something more, and he wanted to go and live with her. But the parole board instead shipped him off to live in a halfway house in Binghamton, New York. When the parole officers in that town read reports on Arthur, they flagged it to their higher-ups, saying they thought he would represent a true danger to their community. But the parole board had to release him somewhere, and they proceeded with Binghamton, settling on ensuring tight restrictions for their ex-con, including curfew, drug tests, and regular check-ins with parole officers, along with continued counseling. But parole officers in Binghamton were already overloaded with cases before a now pudgy and middle-aged Arthur arrived in town. At first he seemed diligent in fulfilling all the requirements of his parole, but sensing that he wasn't being watched very closely, it was only weeks before Arthur had disregarded many of the requirements of his parole, staying out past curfew, and stopping his counseling sessions altogether, declaring himself healed. In an incident that is telling as to Arthur's true mental state, around 5 weeks after he got out, Arthur attacked a woman that he had met around town. She reported that he grabbed at her groin and threw her onto a bed, and that she had to scream in order to get him to stop. That seemed to snap him out of his trance, and he left without harming her further. Inexplicably, nothing was done about this incident, and Arthur wasn't even reprimanded. The parole board ended up sending a delayed bulletin that Arthur Shawcross had moved into Binghamton, several weeks after he had already moved in, that detailed his crimes and requested the police officers keep his presence concealed to the public. One of the detectives that saw the bulletin was a man named Sergeant David Lindsay, the father of a little girl that had been murdered in Binghamton just a few years before. When Lindsay discovered that the parole board had dumped Arthur in his backyard, he was livid, especially when he realized how close Arthur lived in a Volunteers of America halfway house to the Sherry A. Lindsay Park, named in memory of his daughter, where countless neighborhood children hung out. The very day that he saw the bulletin, he set out to find Arthur himself, questioning staff at the Volunteers of America house. Then 2 boys in the park that reported that they had seen somebody matching Arthur's description and that the man had invited them to go fishing, though they had been too skeptical of him to take him up on it. Sergeant Lindsay found Arthur fishing nearby and proceeded to curse him out, telling him that he had better watch his back and stay away from the park, away from kids. He was wearing his police uniform at the time and was disappointed that Arthur stayed respectful, that he didn't have a chance to punch the guy that seemed to him to be the worst scum of the earth. Sergeant Lindsay debated whether he should share the information about Arthur and his background with his community. On the one hand, he knew that it was against protocol, and maybe he could even be fired for it. But on the other, he knew the pain of losing a child. When he told his wife, she was just as outraged as he was, and neither of them could sleep. It wasn't long before he made his choice and tipped off a local journalist named Paul Daphne, working at WBNG-TV, who looked into Arthur and began preparing a larger piece about the flaws in the parole system with the express intention to reveal Arthur Shawcross and his prior crimes to the Binghamton community. It wasn't a decision that Daphne took lightly, but after counseling with experts that agreed that Arthur could be a serious danger to the Binghamton community, they decided to move forward with the piece. The night it aired, several phone calls came into the station of local residents vowing to hunt down Arthur and kill him. Alarmed, Daphne tried to warn the Volunteers of America, but was informed that Arthur was already gone, that the parole board had gotten word that the piece was about to air, and had swiftly moved Arthur out of town. This time, they did try to place Arthur with his new girlfriend, Rose, who was working in Delhi, New York, and had been for years as a nurse's assistant. She was an older, lonely woman who had been in a loveless marriage with an older man that had ended not too long ago. Arthur told her that his crimes were unintentional, and it seems like that was good enough for her. They had begun corresponding while Arthur was still in prison, and she appreciated his devotion after he got out. She pined for a peaceful life with him after many apparent disappointments in her life. Now they were finally together, but the press and the public would not leave them alone. Rose was shocked when the community of Delhi, too, rose up against having Arthur in their town, with her landlady trying to force Rose and Arthur to leave her apartment, with their apartment number and Arthur's crimes broadcast on the news, as the two began receiving threats and harassment from residents who very much intended to run the two of them from town. It worked, and the parole board found another apartment, another town, Fleischmann's, a small, secluded village near the Catskills. It was only days before the press found them again, only days before a similar scene unfolded, maybe in a more dramatic fashion, as the residents formed a literal mob led by the village's mayor to try to scare the two of them off, yelling and threatening outside of their new residence. The exasperated parole board had Rose and Arthur hole up in a motel while trying to figure out what they could do next. They soon settled on placing the two of them in Rochester. Arthur protested at first, not wanting to live in a city, wanting to be close to the outdoors, not liking how far away it was from Rose's family and from his. But the parole board hoped that this time the move would be quiet, that Rochester would prove a large enough city that the move would go largely unnoticed. It did. The parole board set Shawcross and Rose up in the Cadillac Hotel that first night, waiting to see if there would be another outcry. Just as it sounds, the Cadillac is a run-down and seedy establishment near the center of the city, and Rose and Arthur spent that first day grabbing dinner at the Midtown Mall, much to the irritation of their parole officer, who was hoping to avoid anybody spotting or noticing the couple. The two were then stashed in a series of hotels and temporary apartments, and the parole board breathed a sigh of relief when after a couple of weeks, there was no uproar or indeed any local news coverage of the matter at all. They proceeded cautiously with their plan to integrate him into life in this new city, releasing a sparse bulletin to law enforcement that did not mention any specifics of Arthur's crimes. This was against their typical protocol, but they remembered well the scenes in Delhi and Binghamton, that police officers had been a part of leaking that information to the public, and they wanted to make sure that his integration into a new community stuck this time. But this decision may have been one of the most egregious lapses of judgment in this case. And it may have led to Rochester police never suspecting Arthur as bodies began piling up. Maybe they still wouldn't have, given the differences in the victims, but they never had the chance to consider him. Regardless, it now seemed like the parole board had their solution. Arthur and Rose finally settled in at 241 Alexander Street, and Arthur began looking for work as their lives settled into something of a routine. As with his neighbors at the Cloverdale apartments in Watertown, Arthur became known to his neighbors at their Alexander Street apartment as a seemingly helpful and good-natured guy, often performing odd jobs for older residents and buying groceries unexpectedly for others. However, after a while, Arthur got a reputation as a bit of a weirdo for some of his strange outbursts or inappropriate things that he would say, and there were some in the building that avoided him altogether. Arthur was able to secure a job at a local grocery store as a bagger and all-around helper. He seemed like a hard worker, if rough around the edges or off in some way, prone to inappropriate jokes and hitting on some of the younger female cashiers, in a way that was unsettling. But he did all that was asked of him, and though his bosses knew that he was a parolee, they didn't think much of it at first. But curiosity eventually got the better of them, and both asked him at separate times what he had done to be sent to prison. Arthur told each of them different stories, telling the first that he had been convicted of manslaughter for killing the drunk driver that had killed his first wife and child, and telling the other that he had worked for the mob. When comparing their stories one day, they realized this discrepancy and eventually asked a police officer friend to look into his background. When that friend reported back the true nature of Arthur's crimes, it wasn't long before they quietly found a reason to fire Shawcross. Quietly, because they didn't want some kind of lawsuit on their hands. Didn't even want Arthur to know why they had fired him. But there wasn't a shortage of jobs in the city at that time, and soon Arthur found himself employed on the graveyard shift at G&G Salads, making industrial-sized pasta salads for local restaurants. Arthur found that the graveyard shift suited him, and he returned to going everywhere in Rochester by bicycle, even in the dead of winter. He would work late at night and go to a nearby Dunkin' Donuts on Monroe Avenue in the early morning, where he would sit and have coffee and donuts almost every day after work, making pleasant enough conversation with the regulars, who never actually got close to him. To his parole officer, it looked like Arthur was settling in as well as they could have hoped. In fact, he and Rose were soon married in a quiet ceremony at their apartment building. It was Arthur's fourth marriage, and again he seemed devastated that nobody in his family from Watertown came. Despite appearances, however, Rose began to notice a shift in Arthur. He became distant and would go off hunting or fishing often. When he was home, Rose noted some indications of a domineering personality she had never noticed before, a dismissiveness to most women, how he ogled them on TV and sometimes made disgusting comments that made her uncomfortable. But once she learned to ignore these things, their lives were more or less happy, more or less the quiet domestic life that she had wanted. And though Arthur was withdrawn and didn't talk much to her, Rose seemed relatively satisfied with the arrangement. One of the things that Arthur did share with Rose was how hurt he remained that his mom had never visited him in prison, that she still didn't seem to want anything to do with him. She would still talk to him regularly on the phone, but would always refuse his invitations to visit him in Rochester. Rose reported later that Arthur would cry like a baby sometimes after these calls with her. But then, there were the things that Arthur didn't share with Rose, including a growing addiction to local sex workers. Arthur soon became a regular to many of them in town, though he usually introduced himself as Mitch. As shown in part 1 of this series, they were generally a very tough bunch, braving the Rochester winters in order to support themselves, their families, and often their habits. Most of the sex workers who interacted with Arthur thought him to be a pretty harmless guy, old, kind of sad and dumpy. But since he was a regular, many of the girls felt comfortable going off with him. Arthur also started cheating on his wife with a new girlfriend, the mother of one of his former coworkers at the grocery store he had been working at. Her name was Clara Neal. One has to imagine that there was some kind of charisma in Arthur that allowed him to get so close to many of these women. But if you look up videos of him, it can be hard to see it. But for whatever reason, Clara became completely smitten with Arthur, despite his past, which he didn't go into, just mentioned that he had done time. Despite the fact that her daughter regularly mentioned how creepy Arthur was to her, even going so far as to say sexually explicit and completely inappropriate things to her. But her mother ignored it and seemed to have some serious blinders up. She began to trust Arthur, and she would lend him her car regularly, another crucial development that would take Arthur one step closer to a return to violence. When bodies began piling up in Rochester, nobody suspected Arthur Shawcross, and sex workers continued to trust him even as their friends began disappearing. During this time, like many serial killers, Arthur seemed as normal as ever to those closest to him. Nobody seemed to suspect him, not his wife, not his girlfriend, certainly not his parole officer. If not for that fated helicopter search, where police found June Cicero's body and an as-yet unknown Arthur Shawcross looking down from his car, they might never have found him. But now police finally had him across from them in an interrogation room, and finally learned the truth of his crimes in Watertown, his propensity for visiting sex workers in Rochester, and they were certain that Arthur was their man. Of course, he denied it at first, and police went to work to find the information and evidence they would need. They began by circulating Arthur Shawcross's photo to sex workers in the area, who immediately confirmed that this man was the Mitch that police had been seeking. And Joanne Van Nostrand confirmed that her encounter was with Arthur Shawcross. Police also discovered that Arthur had gifted his girlfriend Clara with a piece of jewelry that belonged to June Cicero. Armed with this information and the hope that Arthur really did care for Clara, they threatened to charge her with the murders if he didn't confess. It didn't take long after that before Arthur went on to make what was ultimately an 80-page confession. Arthur also showed investigators to Maria Welsh and Darlene Trippy's bodies. Police from multiple departments and jurisdictions celebrated that day, some crying with relief for finally having found their man, to have brought this terrible time in Rochester to a close. In his confessions, a clear pattern began to emerge as Arthur's MO. He would often pose as a John, and then take a sex worker to a secluded location and gain control of them, after which time he would attack, usually but not always strangling his victims, and sometimes engaging in sex acts with the bodies after death. Arthur told police his version of what happened with each woman. I'm going to include a basic summary of what Arthur says happened in each case. but with the giant, enormous caveat that you cannot take what Arthur Shawcross says at face value. All of the descriptions are difficult, but including what he says happened might offer some important insight into his mind. It also seems true that Arthur often mixed in truth with fiction, so it might give us an idea of what happened to these women in their final moments. For Dorothy Blackburn, his first victim in Rochester, and a woman known to her friends and family as Dotsie, Arthur claimed that he had never been with a sex worker before, that she was his first. He says that at first he thought they were going to go on a real date, that he would take her to dinner. When she ultimately offered him sex for money, he said okay, but claims that Dorothy bit him at some point, after which time he bit her in retaliation. Arthur then claims that Dotsie began laughing at him and calling him names. He says that he became so enraged that he strangled her. For Anna Stephan, the tortured woman who fell into a cycle of drugs after the death of a sister she was very close to, Arthur claims that he picked her up and that they started having sex in the woods. However, a group of kids began approaching, and Arthur became so afraid that he would be caught naked in front of children that he started to panic. When Anna wouldn't keep it down, he says that his rage took over and he strangled her. Arthur helped police identify the bones found by fishermen on Seth Green Island as those of Dorothy Keeler, a homeless woman not known to engage in sex work that some workers at local hospitals and shelters had recognized as missing. He claimed that he had helped Dorothy, had given her money and meals, had even given her regular employment to clean his apartment, and that the two soon began a consensual affair. He told police that they had been down on Seth Green Island one day to fish, and that he had waited until that moment to accuse Dorothy of stealing from him in the apartment. At which time he says that Dorothy threatened to go to his wife Rose about the affair. Arthur claims that he just panicked, that he grabbed a nearby branch and began to hit her with it repeatedly. Arthur then mentions returning to the body sometime later, and that she was right where he had left her. For some reason that he was unable to explain, he says that he then disturbed the body, picking up the skull and tossing it into the Genesee River. Her head was never recovered. For Patty Ives, the once promising and artistic local girl whose life fell apart after a powerful drug addiction, Shawcross paints a familiar picture, saying that they had started to have sex in the woods and that he somehow noticed at some point that she was rifling through his wallet, so he strangled her. For Maria Welsh, the woman who turned tricks to pay her bills and raise a son, Arthur says that he only picked her up to help her keep warm on a cold night. That she offered a date and he accepted, but made her promise that she didn't have her period. He claims that when he ultimately discovered that she did, he asked for his money back and she started swearing at him. He claims again to have become so enraged that he strangled her unconscious, raped her anyway, and then strangled her again until she was dead. For Frances Brown, who had just recently moved back to Rochester after living for a while in New York City, Arthur says her death was an accident, that somehow she just suffocated while they were in the middle of the act. He claims to have then proceeded to have sex with her corpse before pushing her body out of his car and over a cliff. The medical examiner reported at the time that it appeared that she had been beaten savagely before death. For June Stott, the woman who had a learning disability and who had once been homeless, Arthur claims that he had known June from around town, that he had given her some fish that he had caught and saw her frequently at the Midtown Mall food court, which is consistent with accounts given by her boyfriend, Joseph Tibbetts, who had also seen her talking to a man that looked like Arthur. Arthur claims that he had helped June when she was homeless, that he used to pick her up and buy her a meal. On the day that she died, Arthur claims that he took her down to Charlotte Beach in the pier, that they started feeding ducks together, and were sitting alone on an old rug in a secluded section of the beach when June told him that she was a virgin and asked if he would have sex with her. According to Arthur, they began to engage in intercourse, but at a certain point, June just started screaming, saying that she was going to tell police, at which point Arthur strangled her. He added the detail that June didn't fight back at all. After she was dead, Arthur says that he stayed by her body for 2 or 3 hours, talking to her corpse, asking her why it had to be this way. It seems that he still blamed her in some way. He eventually left, but returned a few days later to see if it was true, that he had really killed her. Of course, her body was still there. This is one of his most disturbing admissions, so another quick warning. Arthur claims that he just happened to have a knife on him, and for some reason couldn't help himself. He then cut into her body, making an incision like what a butcher might make with a deer, and cut off parts of her, and ate them. When pressed later about what possibly could have motivated this, all Arthur could say was that he didn't know why. He then claimed to have butchered her in that way because he wanted her to decompose more quickly, because he liked her. For Elizabeth Gibson, the former suburbanite who had formed an addiction to drugs so powerful that she had given up everything, Arthur says that she had come into his car on her own, that he was just having dinner. After talking, Arthur claims that she just suddenly attacked him, and that of course he just panicked and killed her, before proceeding to have sex with her dead body. It should be noted that this is the same woman that Joanne Van Nostrand had seen riding in a car with Arthur, known to her then as Mitch. So this may give a sense of how unreliable Arthur's testimony may be. For Felicia Stevens, a woman whose mother and boyfriend were trying to get her to leave a cycle of addiction and sex work, Arthur claims that she ran up to his car and stuck her head in his window, that she began screaming, and that he strangled her by rolling up his automatic window, then took her body and dumped it in Northampton Park. For June Cicero, the tough, streetwise sex worker whose body police discovered at the same time that they found Arthur, he paints a familiar picture, saying that June began to make fun of him, that he just saw red and started sweating before strangling her. He returned a few days later to mutilate the body and claimed that he ate some parts of her. The way that he frames these murders and seems to pin things or put some culpability on the victims points to something in Arthur's psyche. It's possible that on some level, he really believes that the woman deserved what happened to them in some way, that he might be actually incapable of taking responsibility at the sheer horror of what he did to these women. Of course, the police officers that heard his confession didn't believe his bullshit explanations, but they believed the crimes, and his descriptions of what he did to the bodies fit. With all of these confessions in hand, with eyewitness testimony, and the jewelry given to Clara Neal, prosecutors in Rochester were feeling very confident as they looked toward prosecuting Arthur. He was looking at 10 murder charges within Monroe County and 1 murder charge for a body he had left in neighboring Wayne County. With reports that there was now a suspect, Arthur's face was soon plastered on the front page of all the local papers. Helen Hill, who had finally emerged from the shadow of her daughter's death at Arthur Shawcross's hands and had moved back to Rochester, had to endure even more anger and devastation to see that somehow Arthur had been released, but not only that he had been operating in her city. But she was horrified that Arthur was in town and that he could have murdered one of her other children. Arthur was swiftly taken to Monroe County Jail as the prosecution geared up for the case. Corrections officers were shocked that he seemed relatively normal, like institutional life was familiar and comfortable to him. He kept his cell spotless, told jokes occasionally, and waited for his trial to begin. His girlfriend Clara and wife Rose began fighting over visitation time with him, neither willing to leave his side despite the horrors of his crimes. He even admitted his guilt to them, but both inexplicably stood by him. Trying to unpack why is probably another podcast altogether. A string of new experts and psychiatrists set to work examining Arthur for some pretrial hearings on behalf of the prosecution. As they attempted to understand Arthur and what had motivated him to kill, they found themselves similarly baffled to the counselors at Greenhaven. Many believed that it was a given that Arthur had to have deep traumas in sexual assault as a child, with some credible studies showing that this was usually the case for pedophiles that ended up murdering their victims. But reports and affidavits from Arthur's family in Watertown made some question whether this abuse had actually occurred in Arthur's case. His siblings, parents, and extended family had always denied any and all allegations of abuse, and there were several records about Arthur as he grew, from school and then later on as he got into trouble as an adolescent. Most reports suggested that Arthur seemed to be a normal boy, that his family seemed loving and supportive. The theory of child sexual abuse in Arthur's case wasn't verifiable, but of course it couldn't be ruled out either, and some psychiatrists believed that it must have been present in Arthur's case. And some began asking him leading questions in interviews that appeared to uncover memories of abuse in Arthur's case. The public also wanted to know what had motivated Arthur to commit such disturbing acts. And it wasn't long before the press was interviewing a devastated Betty Shawcross, who once again denied that Arthur had had anything but a perfectly normal childhood, and blamed his accusations and ultimately his murders on 2 serious head injuries he had sustained as a boy, and on his experiences in Vietnam, which she understood to be quite horrific. Some psychiatrists performed brain scans, looking for physical evidence of trauma or some other deformation that could cause such a moral and emotional deficiency. They came up empty. No abnormalities or red flags. Psychiatrists also began to ask about his service in Vietnam, where he promptly rattled off dozens and dozens of horrifying accounts of murder, mutilation, and rape that he had witnessed and taken part in. Some of the stories were so wild and sensational, and the public interest was so great, that journalists began looking into whether any of this could be verified. The sexual assault as a child was nearly impossible to prove one way or the other. But surely some basic information about his military service, an estimated number of kills, corroborating testimony from others that served with him, would make his stories, if true, of great significance, as surely much of what he said would amount to war crimes. As 2 journalists with the Democrat and Chronicle, Steve Mills and J. Leslie Sopko, began to look into Arthur's claims, they were shocked at what they found, not for the horror of it, but for how mundane Arthur's service record seemed to be. They began putting this information together in a 3-part series called Shawcross, The Rage Within. They discovered that Arthur had been a parts and supply specialist for 2 6-month tours of duty in Vietnam. He had been stationed at Camp Inari, a complex that was known for its safety and somewhat posh digs as far as Army standards go, complete with a swimming pool and movie hall. When they contacted the Army, they reported that Arthur had never taken part in a single patrol mission during his service, and saw 0% combat during his tour. Yes, he would have faced occasional shelling at the camp, but in terms of going out into the jungle on dangerous missions, it seemed as though it just hadn't happened. He had never received a Purple Heart or any other medals, as Arthur had specifically claimed in some of his interviews. What's more, Arthur said that he could not remember the names of the men that he served with. Mills and Sopko got to work tracking down those that were actually members of Shawcross's unit. Not a single one of them remembered Shawcross either. No shared brotherhood or war stories. In fact, they uncovered that Arthur had been formally reprimanded for incompetence, and that he was reassigned to Fort Sill in Oklahoma to spare his commanding officers in Vietnam. Their conclusion was that Arthur's wild tales of Rambo-like domination and dehumanization of the enemy was, in their words, almost certainly fabricated. They won an award for journalistic excellence for this work. As specialists and psychiatrists began working to build a theory of Arthur as a cold-hearted but completely sane psychopath for the prosecution, the Wayne County public defender, Ronald Valentine, had been assigned to Arthur's case and was looking for some way to defend the confessed serial killer. He was responsible for defending against only one of Arthur's crimes, the murder of Liz Gibson, who Arthur had dumped in Wayne County. Valentine called on his friend and colleague, a respected psychiatrist named Dr. Richard Krause, who he had relied on for expert advice in cases in the past. He really just wanted his friend to try to understand Arthur and to see whether or not an insanity defense would be viable. And Krause agreed to help without promises, agreed to see where his examination of Arthur would take him. He had extensive experience in psychotherapy, including in sessions with sex offenders and pedophiles, and believed that he would be able to figure Arthur out, though he noted the contradictions and confusion in earlier reports on Arthur. It was during his very first interview that he began to understand that confusion. Arthur seemed, based on his actions and on previous reports, to be every bit the psychopath that some of the prosecutor's psychiatrists had labeled him. But he was also genial and disarming, and he readily admitted guilt almost as soon as they got started with their interview, something that Krause noted was rare in psychopaths. He was also shocked when Arthur admitted, toward the end of that first interview, that he wasn't sure whether he could kill again were he to ever be released, but admitted that he might. It seemed evident that Arthur himself didn't know who he was, what he might be capable of, and what was going on in his mind. Arthur showed a remarkable amount of patience with Krause, granting many interviews and tests in the end, the time that Krause believed he needed to make a determination on the man. He noted that Arthur gave ridiculous reasons for killing these women in Rochester, but that he spoke with a kind of honesty that was confusing. It also wasn't long before he dismissed the idea of Arthur having PTSD from the war, despite how often Arthur would bring it up. He just didn't have any of the symptoms that Krause was familiar with. No nightmares or substance abuse, no panic attacks or anxiety. And instead, Arthur seemed to light up when talking about his claimed experiences of the war, seemed to relax. Krause suspected that Arthur might feel inadequate and was covering this up by claiming to be this one-man killing machine. And he, too, doubted that these claims were true, though Krause wondered, with Arthur's apparent candor, whether he might believe them to be true. He also noted an amiability that came across most of the time with Arthur, but would change on a dime, a hairpin trigger temper that would flare whenever the conversation turned particularly difficult. Reasons for concern, but certainly not evidence of insanity. When Valentine and Krause met with Arthur's defense team in Monroe County, Krause told them that he couldn't testify in any kind of insanity defense, especially at that time. His research to that point had uncovered a man who was greatly disturbed, but very far from the legal threshold of insanity for New York State. Valentine told Krause to keep researching Arthur anyway, to see what he could uncover, and until he could come up with a formal diagnosis. Arthur eventually admitted to Krause that Karen Ann Hill reminded him of his younger sister, as did most of the women he killed in Rochester. It was true that many of them looked alike. Krause had remembered reading about Arthur's attraction to his sister in earlier files, that Arthur had mentioned in earlier interviews that he had fantasized about his sister a lot when he was younger, but that they had never had sex. And yet, during this interview, Arthur switched his story completely and said that he and his sister had actually had sex. He also began talking about Vietnam again, about going off into the jungle by himself, but Krauss was shocked when Arthur suddenly told him that he had never killed anybody, that he would hunt down humans, but that he would ultimately let them go, that he was only trying to scare them. In their very next session, he went back to claiming that he had been a deranged Rambo, raping, killing, and murdering. The more Krauss spoke with Arthur, the more he became convinced that he was certainly not criminally insane. However, Krauss began thinking that Arthur's brain functioning might genuinely be impaired. He decided to reach out to Betty Shawcross and spoke to her by phone for over an hour. Thought she sounded more or less credible about Arthur having a relatively normal childhood. With no obvious trauma or PTSD to pin Arthur's behavior on, Krauss began looking into a genetic test that the defense team in Monroe County had ordered. The test did, in fact, show that Arthur had a genetic abnormality called XYY syndrome, an extra Y chromosome in every cell. The condition is fairly common, with nearly 1 in 1,000 men and boys suffering this disorder, though most men with the condition function completely normally, having average intelligence, and many never realize they have the condition. The research is mixed, but at the time, some claimed that XYY syndrome was linked to a higher propensity toward crime, and it is still linked today with explosive temper and impulsivity, both of which could be used to describe Arthur. Krauss also uncovered a controversial condition called pyroluria that Arthur appeared to suffer from as well, though many experts today say that the disorder is not credible or widely accepted in the medical community. Basically, it's a genetic disorder where a person's body creates too many pyrols, which can cause nutrient deficiencies, and that proponents claim can cause a wide range of symptoms, including mood swings, irritability, and poor memory. While Krauss was skeptical, particularly of the pyroluria, he had to admit that Arthur seemed to exhibit many of the reported symptoms. Krauss finally released a report with his findings. Yeah, there were some cards stacked against Arthur, maybe genetically, maybe when it came to this imbalance of nutrients, possibly with his low verbal IQ that made it difficult for him to connect with others. Krauss tried to explain what drove Arthur's actions, his rich fantasy life to deal with feelings of inadequacy, his love-hate relationship with his mom. But when it came to that crucial finding of legal insanity, Krauss concluded that Arthur definitively did not fit, and told his friend Valentine as the Monroe County trial began. Arthur was charged for 10 counts of murder in Rochester, his lawyers still trying for an insanity defense. The case was covered extensively in the media, but it ended up being a relatively straightforward trial without any twists or turns or new evidence. It lasted for 11 weeks, with the state bringing out a barrage of witnesses that claimed, though Arthur was obviously antisocial and violent, that he was not criminally insane. The only defense witness was Dorothy Otno Lewis, who testified that Arthur had been traumatized as a child with sexual abuse, and that he had also suffered PTSD from his experiences in Vietnam, in direct contradiction to Krauss's findings. Arthur himself sat mostly impassive throughout the trial, sitting with his hands folded across his gut, with little expression throughout. He was found guilty on all 10 murder charges and sentenced to 250 years in prison. Defense attorney Ronald Valentine eventually agreed to a deal, and Arthur Shawcross pled guilty, receiving another life sentence before being shipped off to Sullivan Correctional Facility in Fallsburg, New York, where he would spend the rest of his life. Arthur became as much a pariah in prison as he had been everywhere else, in almost every social setting in his life. Some inmates reported that he was absolutely despised by other inmates, that he didn't have a single friend. He eventually reconnected with a daughter he hadn't known about. He'd gotten her mom pregnant while on leave in Hawaii. And that daughter ended up visiting several times and seemed to want to have a relationship with him despite his crimes. Other than that, Arthur had little interaction with anybody, inside or outside of prison, keeping mainly to himself. Occasionally a journalist or documentary crew would come by and want to interview him, and he granted several interviews during his time there. Otherwise, he was mostly alone, even in a place as busy and crowded as prison. One inmate in particular, named Felipe Rodriguez, served time with Arthur. A religious man, he had lived alongside Arthur for years and didn't question the disgust he felt for the convicted rapist and serial murderer, the child killer. He noted that Arthur would eat his meals while sitting on the floor, even after many years in prison, because none of the other inmates would allow him to eat at their table. He was moved to compassion one day and invited Arthur to eat with them, and the two soon struck up a sort of friendship. Arthur was quiet, silent most of the time, but Felipe believed he saw flashes of real humanity in him. He eventually was able to get Arthur to start going to church, and in 2008, they were planning a baptism of sorts to fully welcome him. The very weekend they were planning to move forward, before they had a chance to go through with their ceremonial baptism and welcoming, Arthur went to the infirmary complaining of leg pain after a recent gallbladder surgery. The nurse at the time didn't take it seriously, but soon it had become a pulmonary embolism and then full-fledged cardiac arrest. Arthur Shawcross died on November 10, 2008. The New York State Correction Commission later determined that Arthur had received grossly negligent, incompetent, and inadequate medical evaluation and treatment, which helped lead to his death at the age of 63, though, of course, there was no public outcry at the time. For his at least 11 victims in Rochester, many family members didn't want to give interviews after his conviction. He left holes in the lives of families who had hoped their daughters would recover, parents who outlived their kids, and children who will never know their moms. For Mary Blake, her family drifted for years, some of her surviving kids engaging in petty crimes, her husband Pete even briefly diving deeper into alcohol. Mary began to believe that Jack was out there somewhere, that Arthur hadn't killed him, that the body presented to her was planted. Her distrust of police was that strong. But things eventually began looking up for her and her family, with Pete giving up alcohol for good, and some of her other kids turning to honest work. She believed that she would be reunited with her son when she died, though she never stopped hoping that he was alive somewhere and would return to her in person one day. For Helen Hill, proving again what a beautiful soul she was, Helen actually felt sadness and empathy for Arthur's mother, the pain that she must be going through. She felt it so strongly that she called Betty one day and told her who she was. They stayed on the phone together for a while and sobbed. She wasn't religious, but she also believed that she would meet Karen again one day. As she stated to Jack Olson in The Misbegotten Son, "I don't believe in heaven or hell, but I have the notion that Karen's waiting for me. I don't know where. I don't know if we're going to be able to look at each other, or if I'll be able to hold her on my lap and tell her that I love her. Maybe we'll just be two souls together, but I will see my baby again." And that is the end of this 3-part series on Arthur Shawcross and his victims. I want to acknowledge again one of my most important sources for this story, an excellent work of journalism called The Misbegotten Son by Jack Olson. It includes many first-person interviews that provided great and invaluable insight to this case. If you're interested in reading these stories from the perspective of the people who are closest to the case, this book is a great resource. You can find a link on our website at crimeandsacrifice.com. Finally, I would like to close this case with a few of my thoughts, why I chose it, and why I went into such detail. As anybody who has listened to prior episodes has learned, I grew up in Rochester, New York. My house was in a rural area just outside Rochester, close to where several of the bodies were found. Even more chilling to me now, looking back on it, is that I had close family working in the Monroe County Jail. They were there during the events leading up to Arthur's arrest. One reminded me recently of how crowded the jail eventually got with sex workers as they tried desperately to prevent further deaths. They also interacted with Arthur while he awaited trial. He seemed like just a normal, soft-spoken guy. I was just a baby when these events happened, but I grew up with the shadow and knowledge of this case. I think Arthur Shawcross may have been the first time that I was aware of what a serial killer is. An idea that, unlike ghost stories or horror films, actually genuinely terrified and fascinated me. I think it is this case, more than any other, that may have stoked my interest in true crime. And hearing reports that Arthur seemed like just another normal person always made me wonder, how could somebody like that have committed these crimes? It was a scary thought to me then. How can somebody that just seems like anybody else be capable of such horrific and evil acts? That makes it seem like it's something you can never really protect against. When I learned as an adult that Arthur had committed gruesome crimes even before his spree in Rochester, that somehow he had been released from prison despite his obvious danger to society, I began to really want to research this case and to do a deep dive to try to figure out what had happened, what had gone wrong with the system, and to even explore what had gone wrong with Arthur himself. But researching this case has not led me to any clear revelations. In fact, I think it's left me a little bit more unsettled. There are serial killers that I feel are clearly psychopathic, who have no emotion or such muted emotion that they can't really understand empathy or feel remorse. But Arthur seemed like such a tortured person, sick and demented, and not really worthy of anybody's sympathy. And yet, he can't have been unworthy of compassion his whole life. I found myself wondering about Arthur as a boy. I wanted to find the point where things shifted, where I could turn off my compassion, or to be able to recognize the point where everything that was good in Arthur was gone, and that maybe that was when he was able to start killing. The truth, as it usually is just so much more nuanced than that. It seems like there may have been some redeemable things about Arthur until the day he died. That maybe he really could love and feel sadness and want forgiveness. Like most of us. But to see him as just as human as the rest of us seems, on some level, like a chilling thought to me. One that I think we have to face if we are to ever come to terms with the good and evil that we are all capable of. Personally, my hope is that this awareness leads me to be better, by guarding against the awful things I know I'm capable of, and empowering me to do what I know in my bones is right. I do think that killing is a choice for almost every murderer, and that Arthur chose the life that he did. I feel sorry for him. The sad, limited, brutal, and disgusting life that he lived, and I hope that he really did find some peace before the end. As for the victims, that was always a hole for me when I heard about this case growing up, and I was happy to learn about them and what they were like. Thinking about them makes me hope that there really is some kind of heaven, that their pain and sorrow is gone, but that somehow, somewhere, they live on, waiting to be reunited with their loved ones. That's all I've got for this week. If you enjoyed this series, please consider rating and reviewing the show to help us out. You can also find the show notes for this episode, all of my references, and some photos of Shawcross after his capture in Rochester on our website at crimeandsacrifice.com. Thank you for listening. What kind of person will you choose to be?